Thank you for downloading this Council on Foreign Relations video. CFR is an independent national membership organization and nonpartisan research center. For more information, please visit us online at cfr.org.
Well, good evening, and welcome to the Council on Foreign Relations, and welcome to the annual John B. Hurford Memorial Lecture, which is dedicated to providing a venue where new ideas in this business can be discussed. We'll get to that in a second. Let me thank the Hurford Foundation and its directors, Bob Miller, Bill Priest, and is it Jane Kurtzman? And great of you to do that and be here. This meeting, I should tell everybody, is being teleconferenced to both our national and corporate members. There's a laptop computer here. I will dazzle you all with my technological prowess until I fail to dazzle you all with my lack of technical prowess. And so I will take questions at some point from those connected through cyberspace. We're going to begin for a bit of time with Secretary Albright and myself having a bit of a chit-chat, which we promised to let you in on. And then we will open it up to you, our members. This is on the record, I am told. We have with us, as you know, Madeleine Albright, who is not just the former Secretary of State, though that's pretty good. She is, more important, a member of the Board of Directors of the Council on Foreign Relations, so she's one of my bosses. And in the particular context of tonight, she is the chair of the group of experts who has been asked to develop or help develop the new strategic concept for NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, I have to give you, this is true confessions here. About, 2 weeks ago or so, I wrote a piece for that salmon-colored newspaper. Not the New York Observer either. And the opening sentence said, "It is more than a little ironic that NATO has committed itself to defining a new strategic concept at precisely the moment the transatlantic relationship counts for less than at any time since the 1930s. An email shows up. "Look forward to equal time once our report is out. As Mark Twain would say, your report of NATO's death is highly exaggerated. Love, Madeleine." So, Madeleine, Madam Secretary, tell us about this process. Seriously, you are the wise woman of the wise men group, and essentially who've been brought in to help develop this concept by the NATO Secretary General. So why don't we, for people who aren't familiar with the background, I think what would be great, just to tee this up, would be to explain kind of how we got to tonight.
Well, first of all, thank you for giving me equal time. What happened was that last April was the 60th anniversary of NATO, and the heads of state got together in Strasbourg-Kiel and felt that it was time to have a new strategic concept. The last one was written in 1999, before the new countries came into NATO and before 9/11. And so the world had changed in many, many ways, and so the heads thought that something should be done about it. There's also a new Secretary General of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former Prime Minister of Denmark, and he is the one that was tasked with writing the new strategic concept. However, what happened was that the heads of state also thought that it would be useful to get a group of experts to advise him on how to put the strategic concept together. In other words, to kind of provide the building blocks and recommendations for it. So every country then named an expert, and I was named by the United States. And then what happened was Secretary General Rasmussen selected 12 of the 28 as individuals to be on this group of experts, automatically irritating 16 countries. And then he asked me to chair it. And so what we've had, and it's really been a very interesting process and the most transparent ever for creating one of these strategic concepts, is, first of all, we had 4 seminars, and the first one was on laying all the problems of the world on the table. What were the various threats and issues that had to be dealt with? The second one was on lessons that were there from previous NATO operations in the Balkans and in Afghanistan. The third was on partnerships. And what has happened is NATO has more partners than it has members, and how the partnerships work. And the fourth one was on the capabilities that NATO has in order to fulfill whatever the desires of the members are. And then we did consultations in every NATO capital, and we also had consultations with the EU and the OSCE and the UN and Russians and a variety of other partners that we talked with. And then our group, in fact, put together this report that is kind of 2 parts. There's a shorter part, which is a summary, and I believe quite readable, and then a second part, which is also more readable than any previous strategic concept background on some of the recommendations. So that's the process.
So let me ask the obvious question, which is what's wrong with the current strategic concept, and why, after a decade, is it really necessary to have a new one?
Well, I think the real thing is because of the fact that the last one was written before any of the new, it was at 16, and so by having 28 members, it does change how this alliance operates. And also, what has happened is it is very clear, as it was in '99, but clearer to this day, that this is not an alliance against the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist. And also that there are more and more activities that are required outside of area or expeditionary. And I think what we managed to do in this new rewriting of it, and I'd have to keep stressing that this is not the strategic concept, it's just the background for it, is to combine 2 things. One is to reiterate and reassure that Article 5, which is the central part of the North Atlantic Treaty, which is an attack on one is an attack on all, is not incompatible with what are now out-of-area operations, that in order to be secure at home, you have to be able to deal with the threats from abroad. And so that's why we're calling it assured security and dynamic engagement. In other words, it is not just a static alliance, but one that is prepared to deal with the threats that are coming from outside.
That said, though, isn't it true that NATO has evolved significantly, not just in its membership, but in its focus, and in, I would say, moving away from Article 5. Article 5, as the Secretary just said, is this, what I would call a collective defense agreement. Attack on one is an attack on all. Article 4, which tends to get read less, is really more of a security arrangement, that basically the members of NATO also have this optional ability to go off and do other things, even if it's not necessarily a direct threat to the common defense. Isn't that really much more the future of NATO, this kind of, we see things out there, some of us may decide to do it, some of us may stay at home minding other things, and that rather than NATO acting as NATO, subsets of NATO will go off and do some things in Afghanistan or conceivably Iraq or other places, who knows what, in Africa one day, and this is really the future of the alliance?
Well, it's yes and no. Article 5, which is my new pen.
I was going to ask you about that. That was my last question.
To many members of NATO, Article 5 continues to be totally central. And I think that was one of the aspects of the discussion that we had, was to many members that assured security is what this is all about. And what is stated a number of times in this report is that the security of all continues to be the major aspect. The part, and it's interesting that you mentioned Article 4, because we looked at Article 4 and have said that it is much more important than ever before, because it in many ways creates the political community that we think NATO is. And what we were calling for, and we had interesting discussions about this, was that Article 4 should be used more in terms of members bringing problems to NATO before they got to the military point. That it allowed for discussion, it allowed for crisis management, it allowed for sharing of ideas, and then working through the partnerships, exactly. The partnership point, though, is not so much the way you put it, in terms of coalitions of willing, but basically